Welcome everyone to Male Fuzz TV. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about Person of Interest, Season 1, Episode 1. It is simply called a pilot. So, welcome to the start of a new series. I am doing this for no other reason than I want to watch Person of Interest. I bought it when it was on sale about a year ago on iTunes, and I've been looking for a good reason to dive in. And new TV's a little bit quiet right now as far as like my tastes go. There's not a lot that's really captivating me, so I felt like a good time to start a regular series where I'm working through a classic show. And the classic, all I really mean is not currently airing. It's not that old. It debuted in September 2011 and finished in 2016. It's 5 seasons long. And a lot like other network shows that I liked around this time that were just a little bit earlier, Fringe and Chuck are the ones I'm thinking of. The last season, season 5, is only 13 episodes. They basically got a final season to finish its story, which is neat. It's always nice when that happens. But I'd heard good things about this, and I'm also not going in completely blind because I've actually seen, I think, the first 2 seasons before. It was a while ago. I think it was when the show was ending that I started watching originally, and for whatever reason things got busy. I think me and Connor were recording like a shit ton of TV reviews every week at the time, and I just didn't have time to just watch a show for my own like enjoyment on top of all the reviews that were going on. So it kind of fell to the side, and then enough time passed that I knew that if whenever I was going to go back to it, it was going to be starting from episode 1 again and sort of going through it. And just to put them, obviously there's some larger ideas from the first 2 seasons and maybe bigger moments that I kind of remember. But for example, there's a swerve in this first episode that I did not remember. So a lot of the episode to episode plots I do not recall really at all, and there wasn't even like a moment in this episode where it kind of like clicked and I went, oh, I remember this. I'm sure there'll be a couple of things like that as I go through the first couple of seasons, but there was nothing in this first episode that was like that. Moments, sure, but not big plot points, not like the twists that happens in the episode. So yeah, I'll pretty much just go straight into like spoiler territory just for episode 1. But I will just say before I get into it that like the show, just the basic premise of it is that what's his face? Michael Emerson plays this billionaire named Harold Finch, who effectively hires Jim Caviezel's character John Reese to kind of, when it was coming out originally, I remember hearing people say it was like Batman, but Batman split into 2 people, where you've got the billionaire part of the Batman, which is, the billionaire character, and then he hires someone with the physical skills, Jim Caviezel, to go and fight crime and save people and stuff like that. Which is not to say that it feels like a superhero show. Actually, if anything, it feels more like an action show. I think this was on CBS, and CBS is not typically a network that gives me shows I give a shit about. And I think you can see at face value, especially with the aesthetic that it's kind of going for at the start of the show, how it would just fall into their lineup and it would just be this different case every week. And I think a lot of the first couple seasons are, here's a case every week. But it's got an interesting setup to sort of present what its cases are. I guess it's kind of bringing in a little bit of that Minority Report kind of idea where basically there's a system here that is giving the billionaire character basically just a name. In fact, it's not even a name, it's a social security number, but effectively a name of someone who's going to be involved in something bad in the near future. But there's no details to it, so it's kind of open for each episode to do its own thing, and like, there's a lot of variety potential of, okay, what is the actual big deal? The most obvious thing you might think of is, oh, this is someone who's been tracked by the mob to be murdered, right? But it could turn out to be a lot of different things, and even this first episode kind of turns some tropes on its head to make it a little less predictable. And even though I'm sure some of the more predictable examples will come up, it's making it very clear that there's going to be a variety of different things that can come from that. But the bigger thing, though, that was what made me want to watch it initially, because I didn't really watch it when it first debuted. Even though I like Michael Emerson from Lost, he was very good in that show. And I think I sort of wrote it off as, oh, it's a CBS case of the week show where someone's, tracking down bad guys, right? Pretty typical. But the show kind of gained a cult following, and I definitely heard murmurs as time went on that it was a very good and well-liked show from those who were sticking with it, but also that it was dipping into some other genres that maybe weren't obvious when the show launched. It's the sort of thing that I think I could maybe predict from the concept, but I wouldn't have expected a CBS show to go down that path. And people seemed to be really into it. Around the time it was finishing, people were glad it was getting an ending, which told me it was a show that had a story, that it was, had a serialized overall story, even if it's still pretty case of the week a lot of the time. But a lot of shows I like in the 90s are kind of like that, where the overall serialized story starts to creep in the more it goes on. In fact, Fringe is a great example of one that it was literally case of the week, freak or monster of the week episodes where here's the case, something weird and sci-fi is happening, and rinse and repeat. And season 1's very like that. Season 2 still like that, but better. But along the way, and about mid-season 2, it really started to open up. And then by the time you get to season 3, it's just a full-on serialized show, because at that point, the plot is overtaken just the general case of the week. But it kind of fits naturally, because it forms this backstory that all these characters have been working through before all the stuff hits the fan. It makes it exciting when it becomes more of a serialized show. So that format can definitely work. And I'm not sure how heavy into serialized this show is going to go in the later seasons, but season 1, from what I remember, is definitely very case of the week. But we'll see how that goes and dive into it. So I'm not going to spoil later things as best I can. If I do happen to remember anything, I'm going to try and present any kind of analysis I have of this episode and the episodes forthcoming with just what's in the episode, and kind of how I, if it is something where I do have an answer because I do vaguely remember something from the first time I watched the first 2 seasons, I will try and remember, did I feel something back then that I can sort of bring up now that works in the context of not spoiling anything ahead. But I'm looking forward to getting into it. So you've got a show with action, you've got a show with a variety of characters. There's vaguely, there's a couple of cop characters as well that are introduced. One of whom seems to be the good cop, who's kind of like your Jim Gordon-esque character, and then another one who's, I don't have a parallel in Batman to compare it to, which is, I guess, is a good thing. You don't want to be able to just compare everything to Batman. So, yeah, we'll get into it. Also, there is a sly cameo from William Sadler in this first episode, who I don't think is a recurring character. I think he's just here in one scene, and that's him. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he ends up in a recurring thing, and I just don't remember that. But yeah, so I'll get into the first episode. So I will say spoilers for episode 1, but as with any show like this, the pilot is largely just setting things up. There's not really that many things to spoil, I would say. Except maybe one swerve in how the plot kind of actually, the plot of the episode, I mean, how that wraps up. But by and large, a lot of it's the introduction to Reese, to Finch, to Detective Carter, who is, and I've never quite learned how to say this actor's first name, but I'll just go with Taraji P. Henson. I'm probably butchering that. Taraji? I really should have looked that up. But yeah, so she's, she was in, was it Empire? She went on to be in, she's been in some movies as well. She's got a bit of a fan base actually these days. People like her. So she's in there as Carter, and then we've got kind of the more corrupt cop, Lionel Fusco, played by Kevin Chapman. So that's kind of our 4 ongoing main characters. And this episode sets up our main character, Reese, who is our ex-agent, badass, but now he's just a homeless man, just hanging out in New York. But he is, which by the way, that's one thing I should mention about this first episode, is there's so much, as far as I can tell, authentically shot in location in New York. Like this pilot must have cost a fortune as far as like TV episodes go, because they're in a lot of like real New York locations, at least to my eye. Maybe they're faking it with a different city or something, but it looked pretty convincing at least. So anyway, so yeah, Reese is introduced, and his whole thing that's set up in this episode, right? We get some of the basic details of his character, which are pretty, they're pretty typical of the genre, and you're kind of your John Wick-esque sort of badass who's really good at what he does, who can go into a room and win a fight with 8 men, even if they're armed, because he knows what he's doing. I'm not saying it's presented quite as cool as John Wick is, but I'm just to give you an example of the type of character that we're talking about, and even the fact that his wife, or did they actually get married? Maybe it was just someone he was going to marry, his fiance, but his love interest in his backstory is dead, right? She's been dead for a long time, and it also sets up through some of the dialogue with Finch that he's someone who was like this badass agent who did covert ops and things like that, or it's kind of it's still kind of mysterious in this episode. It's not we don't get exact details, but there's a lot of generalizations of what he might have been up to. But at some point he began to doubt who was doing this for. Like, he began to doubt the orders that he was being given and like how righteous they were, and sort of started to doubt the system that he was working for effectively. So that's kind of the key basics we get of his character, and he's kind of just this vagrant now, going around until Finch basically just picks him up and offers him the job, which notably happens after Reese gets into a fight on a subway. He ends up getting into a fight with some pricks basically, and beats the shit out of them. But notably, as much as he beats people up in this episode, and even when he starts shooting people, he tends to like shoot people in the leg. No, that's not to say he doesn't kill anyone, because he does kill one or two by the end, definitely. But typically in most scenes, when he's just sort of quickly trying to like take secure a room, he'll just shoot people in the leg. It's not until there's someone who is like really heinous, he makes it clear he doesn't really like killing people, but he's very good at it. So it's setting up the reluctant hero. He's got noble ideas, intentions, or whatever. As far as like his portrayal goes in episode 1, yeah, obviously a lot of these things that I'm saying are pretty generic as far as this type of character goes. Jim Caviezel is okay in the role. I think he looks quite goofy early on in the episode when he has the beard and the shaggy hair. I'm not sure if it was like any of that was real. It looked really fake when I first saw it, but I was kind of looking. He has it for a good few scenes, and I was kind of looking at it closely, trying to see like if I could see the seams and things like that, and I never quite could, but it still looked kind of fake. It sounded the beard looked pretty fake to me, but it did not suit him at the very least, which is fine. That's part of the point is that he looks all shit and then cleans himself up when he becomes super secret agent man. But I think some of his like dialogue in this episode like isn't the best. He has moments where he's supposed to be this badass who has like very calmly spoken like, monologues and one-liners. Some are just okay. I think there's one particularly good one though. There's a scene in this episode where he's been captured after he's caught spying by the villains, and he's in the car with Lionel, who is a corrupt cop, because part of the twist of the plot of this episode is that a lot of the villains we're dealing with are actually cops who are corrupt. And Lionel's this corrupt cop who's driving him out to this location to be murdered. He's going to kill him for his other corrupt cop like bosses, his gang members effectively. And I think this scene is probably the best Reese comes across as a badass. And I think it's because he's so confident, and I think part of it's just how it's shot. David Semmel, who directed this pilot, he's got Reese behind sort of the, he's in the back of a cop car, so it's got this kind of the cross-hatching cage, between the seats, right, kind of at the back. So he almost looks like he's in a confessional at church, but the sunlight's sort of coming through the holes of the cage, and he's basically saying, Lionel, I've been watching you for a while, and this makes Lionel kind of like look at him a little bit funny, because he's kind of playing along and smiling and talking about whatever he's doing, But until he starts like dropping details that he shouldn't know, because I think one of the things I actually quite like about this episode and how Reese gets involved with all of the plot is that genuinely no one involved in the plot ever actually becomes aware of who he really is, and when he does kind of get caught spying, everyone's like, who is this guy? We have no idea who this is. I actually really like that, like, complete outsider to like the entire affair, where it really is this disruptive force, I guess, in a lot of ways like an early Batman story where the criminals are just like, what the hell's going on? Who is this guy? Why is there some random dude here seemingly try to get in the middle of our business? I kind of appreciate that. But he starts saying to Lionel that, he asks him, why did you start, why did you become corrupt, basically? When did you realize you were one of the bad guys and not just like an honest, noble cop? And he gives him some answer about, the corruption and like, the 1% and Wall Street all stealing money from people, so why should he not steal, blah, blah, blah. And Reese basically says he thinks that's bullshit and that he is doing it more of some sense of loyalty than just money, than just sort of getting something for himself. And because of that, he's not going to kill him. And like I said, he's kind of gone out of his way this episode for the most part not to kill. There's at least one guy that he definitely kills by the end, but he's mostly going out of his way to shoot in the leg and things like that. So I don't actually think he would have killed him anyway, but he's saying that. And it's kind of this hint, because like I said, one of the few details we get about Reese's past in this episode is that he started to question who he was working for, and you get this sense that he probably was this very loyal, soldier, effectively, this loyal agent who would go and like assassinate people for the government and whatever else it might have been. And at some point, he started to question who was giving him these orders and why he was doing these things, and that some of this might actually be quite evil. And I think, in some level, if he's really recognizing that in Lionel, if he's really looking at him and thinking to himself, this is someone who's sort of ended up in this position because he's being loyal to all these people that are supposed to be his friends and co-workers, but he kind of maybe deep down knows that it's wrong. Maybe he sees a chance of redemption in Lionel because he kind of relates in some way. There's not a lot to go in this episode, but it's the one sort of connection between the two things that kind of sticks out to me. And effectively, I'm comparing Carter more like the Jim Gordon, and that she's the one good cop who is reluctantly maybe going to probably become an ally. And I say that just because of the way this episode sets it up. I don't think that's revealing anything. It's quite clear, she's the good cop, and eventually she's probably going to accept help from him at some point. Like, that is clear as day in episode 1. It's not a spoiler. But I think what's interesting about Lionel, and what makes him kind of unique, is he's the cop that Reese is going to go to right from the get-go, but it's not going to be out of some sense of nobility or anything like that. He's going to Lionel because Lionel's scared of him, and Lionel thinks that if he doesn't do what Reese says, he'll reveal how much of a dirty cop he is, or he'll kill him, or whatever. It's this kind of like, it's almost like Jim Gordon, but only because he's under duress. And he's being forced to do all these things. And we get like a taste of that in this episode, where it tells him to go hide the body of the main corrupt cop that is the one that he ends up killing. And to be fair, by the time he kills him, he kind of deserves it. Like, he's like willing to kill a child to like kill the target that is going to get them all in trouble to save his own skin. And he's quite gleeful about it as well. So by the time we get to that standoff, like, he's kind of earned his death. And I think we, the audience, we're on board. Go for it. Knock yourself out. That's all fine. So yeah. So I guess that's Reese to an extent, and it's Lionel as well that I've talked about there. Just to sort of one more thing on Reese, I suppose, before we go on, is just going back into the loyalty thing. I suppose the other bit of evidence for that is that when we get little flashbacks to him and his fiancée, they're on vacation in Mexico, and they're talking about how he's about to ship out again for a few weeks before he comes back. And basically he reveals that he's quit his job and that he's going to stay with her because they're in love and they want to get married. And it's kind of sweet and all that. And then there's almost like a reveal, there's almost like a little mini twist that this is the morning of 9/11. And they see it on TV. And without saying a single word, you get that he changed his mind and signed, went back to his, I say signed back up. I'm sure he wasn't that low ranking at this point. He seems like he was up the food chain, as it were. But I'm sure you get one little moment here where he's looking at the TV in horror, and you completely get that he went back on his word, didn't stay here with her, and he went out of some sense of, patriotism, out of some sense of loyalty to the country, and, went to do his job. And then over the last 10 years with like hunting people and whatever that the government was making him do, he's become disillusioned. He's questioned everything. So that ties into the whole loyalty thing and how he was once very loyal, and until he realized the people he was being loyal to weren't necessarily making noble decisions. So yeah, I think it sets up the character well enough. It's as with any pilot, you've only got 42, I think it's 44 minutes this one was like officially on iTunes. You don't have a lot of time, and I think most network pilots end up feeling a little bit rushed because of that. I think this one actually comes out better than most, to be honest. I think it does a decent job of setting everything up, giving you a little taste of where things could go and some potential. Although its main goal is very much to set up the core premise of the show, which is going to be this case of the week, to a point anyway. Which brings us to Finch, enlisting him. He bails him out of jail after the fight at the start, and tries to offer him this job where he's like, hey, this woman over here, this stranger, she's next on this list. She's the next list on this name. She's the next number on this list, is what I was trying to say. And something's going to happen to her. So what I'm asking you to do is to follow her and find out what's going on. And obviously he says, this is stupid. This is probably your ex-wife or something, and you're being a creep. I'm just going to walk away. Perfectly natural response. But then, of course, Finch makes an elaborate thing where he kidnaps someone he's asleep and makes them think someone's in trouble, and makes a point of saying, someone got murdered here 2 years ago and we couldn't stop it. You can stop something happening to her. And the woman that he's met to help is this lawyer named Diane Henson. And I was very distracted in her scenes because she looks a lot like Blake Lively, but she's not Blake Lively, and it was really throwing me off through at least our early scenes when I was sort of like, because at first I thought it was Blake Lively. I was like, oh, Blake Lively's in the pilot of this. I guess timeline wise, maybe she was not big enough yet. She was still doing the odd TV thing like this. But no, it's not her. It just looks a lot like her. But so he's kind of reluctant. He keeps complaining that he's not got enough information. But I'll just skip ahead to later in the episode here, where Finch kind of finally talks about what's going on, and this again ties into 9/11. And I actually think this is a really good little trick here from a writing perspective, is that both of these guys' stories both fundamentally are tied to the same world event. I actually think that's really smart, and it's this like tether between them, like as different as these two are, as much as one's like a tech billionaire and the other one's this military dude. There is this thing that linked them where both of their paths were set in motion because of 9/11. And he explains he was tasked with building a system that would be used for surveillance and used to basically find threats, like terror threats, in the country. And it would look through everyone's phones, it would look through every camera, it would every microphone, it would listen, it would do everything, complete and utter, surveillance. And he explains that it was too good, and that it started like giving all these like names and numbers and whatever for regular things that were going to happen. And by regular things, I mean regular smaller crimes, like it would give the terror threats, but it would also give people who were likely going to be murdered or likely going to commit robbery or likely do what this and this, all the normal stuff that happens all the time. And basically he had to like filter it so that it was only the terror threats were the ones they'd actually respond to. So this like discarded list of things just sort of sat there, and he basically felt guilty about that because over time he obviously would have started to notice that some of these names and things that were coming out of the machine were people who were getting murdered, and it's like we could have done some to stop that, and instead we're ignoring them, and that guilt. So he built a backdoor. He doesn't work with them anymore. He's far away from the project, but he built a backdoor that is just enough that sends him out the social security numbers of the discarded list. And that's what he wants to work through. That's what he's got John Reese here for. He wants him to go and help these people, and he's going to fund it, obviously. He's going to be the guy at the computer giving them information. Simple enough setup. There's some nice ideas in here. Like you've got this like ultra illegal surveillance system, effectively, and this idea that the country is so obsessed, the government's so obsessed with finding terror threats that it's not solving all of the actual everyday problems that would immensely benefit everyone if like they did get stopped. There's kind of a bit of political commentary there. But also you've got these two characters who ultimately are being presented to as fairly heroic in that they want to do good things. They want to save people. They want to stop bad things from happening. They both have maybe elements of guilt. Certainly Finch, the billionaire, has elements of guilt because he created this thing and he was seeing this discarded list. I get the sense that Reese also has some guilt, probably from some of the things that the government made him do, that he's, in hindsight, looked back on and sort of reconsidered what the purpose of those like maybe murders were or whatever they are. So I think it does a lot of interesting setup from a conceptual level as far as these two characters, and they're again, it's not like breaking new ground as far as like giving us completely new types of character, but it's doing a pretty good job of linking them together and setting up kind of their mission statement at the start of the show that we can then build upon as things go on. Detective Carter, we don't have quite as much to talk about yet. She basically, it's a running thing where she keeps hearing about a man in a suit who's like walked in and like beat up an entire gang on her own, or a man in a suit who like took down the corrupt cops. And she obviously meets Reese at the start of the episode when he's got the beard and the hair. So it's clearly setting up that he's going to be this ghost to her that's solving things in the background, and she's probably going to be like determined to find out who it is. So that's a pretty nice enough hook on its own. The key thing it does with her is that in her one real scene where she gets to talk for more than a couple of lines, which is at the start of the episode when she's talking to Reese and he's been arrested, is she is compassionate. She looks at the footage and is obviously like very like she figures out quite quickly that that this fighting that you're doing is like advanced. This isn't even just joining the military training. This is like special forces stuff. This isn't regular stuff. She deduces a lot of things, so it shows that she's smart. I'm knocking over things with my foot, apologies. But it shows that she's smart and shows that she's a good detective. But the bigger thing here, again, much like the other two main characters where they're showing that they're heroic, so we'll like them, is that she immediately thinks that he's in need. She immediately sees Reese as someone who is suffering because he's come back, presumably from combat of some kind. She's maybe thinking he's more typical military, and she's talking about PTSD and not fitting back into society, and she's asking, do you need help? So she is showing this level of concern, even though she's acknowledging that he might be quite dangerous, that his training is very severe and very specific, much like Taken. He's got a specific set of skills, but her main driving force of the scene is asking if he needs help. And she also recognizes that the guys that he beat up were a bunch of assholes, and even jokes that you could have let them land a few punches to make it easier for us to just call it self-defense. If anything, he was so effective that, that it just looks like he beat these guys up, even though they definitely were the ones starting it. So I think it does a good job, even though she doesn't get a lot of time in this episode, of just making it very clear right away. Here's a reason to like her. She's asking if he needs help. And he does need help. That's the beauty of it. It's just not exactly the sort of help that she's thinking. In fact, it's directly referenced by Finch when he's talking to him in a scene or two's time, where he says, you don't need a psychiatrist, you need a purpose. So he's almost directly picking up that theme from her dialogue, where he's saying, the episode is relative for an episode that has to condense so much stuff into a pilot and set up these characters, set up this big premise. It does do a pretty reasonable job of defining your core four main characters and like who you should like, who you should trust, who you should be rooting for. Even if they've got some shadier parts to their past that have been kept secretive just now, it gives you enough to kind of be hooked into them. And that's very good. The actual plot of the episode, which is the woman that he's tasked with protecting, we've got, him bugging her, we've got him tailing her. Like I mentioned earlier, them not even or even her not recognizing him, because it would be very easy for him to go up and like strike a conversation with her in a coffee shop or something, so that when he turned up later on spying on her, when she turns out to be a bad guy, that's the big twist of the episode, is she's the ringleader of these corrupt assholes. She doesn't even have a moment where she's like, oh, I recognize this guy, you were in the coffee shop or something. It doesn't do that. I actually really appreciate that. I think, one, it saves a bit of time, and like I said, you're very time constrained in a pilot. I think number two, though, I just appreciate it because it feels like the most obvious thing that most shows like this would do. They would have that moment because they would want that intrigue where she realizes. But I actually really appreciated that he considered that approach of like befriending her to get her trust, but was like, no, it's actually quicker just to like, hack her phone and tail her and hack this, plant a bug here or whatever. The covert option, I think he called it. So, it does all that stuff, and then she turns out to be the bad guy, which is a nice little swerve because, he's kind of running around thinking she's in danger, that someone's going to hurt her. She's got like a guy she works with at the district attorney office or whatever it is, and this guy at first comes across like he might be a threat, and he maybe is, harassing her, trying to ask her for a date, things like that. But in hindsight, even though he did ask her to go to dinner, everything else he said in hindsight actually tracks with the fact that he's not the bad guy. He's actually suspicious of her. That's why he's looking at her computer when she's not there. That's why he's asking if she's feeling okay, because he's noticing bizarre behavior. It all kind of in hindsight like works with like the fact that he just turns out to be a normal middle-aged guy with a kid. And it's when they go to assassinate him later in the episode, and then Reese has to go in and save them without the target ever seeing him. That's when you realize these corrupt cops are really bad, because they're like, they don't second guess when there's a kid there. The main guy's just like, no, we'll just have to kill him too. So it gives us clear villains that are baddies, gives us Reese being very good at what he does, and sometimes it shows you what he does and gives you the action sequence, like him putting on the ski mask and firing the grenade launcher, or some of the hand-to-hand combat where he goes and gets the guns, and it's the punks from the start of the episode. That's where William Sadler is in the episode. They're having like a gun trade, like they're buying guns from someone, and he just comes in and like takes them all down. But he notably shoots most of them in the leg, I think. At least from what I could tell in the scene. It does these things, but then there's other moments where it'll just cut away and sort of give you the implication that we know he's a badass, we know he can handle this moment. And it does that at the end of the episode when he's standing off against the corrupt cop, which is effective, but again, also saves a bit of time, and you don't have a lot of time, and there's a lot of stuff to get across this episode. So that sets up the basic idea. There'll be another name, or another number, which will lead to a person, and we have to figure out each episode who that person is, why they're in danger, or why they're a part of the danger, perhaps, as it turned out to be in this episode, and that's what it's going to be. As far as like just the raw plot is going to be for a while. But obviously it's setting up these characters who potentially will grow, and having seen season 1 and 2, I do know that they do grow, and there's maybe another character introduced here or there. And the big thing though is the tech itself, and the episode doesn't dwell on it too much when Finch is explaining all the cameras and stuff, and we see the street cameras, and we see the phones being used, is the idea that this system is picking out these things, this computer is finding this stuff. That is where the big sort of more interesting shift goes, I would say, in terms of what this show is sort of slowly starts to use. I won't say any more. I'll just say that becomes a bigger deal as time goes on, from what I remember, and is certainly kind of where the intrigue for my taste starts to come into it a little bit more. So I'm very much excited to going through this. And when I watched this the first time, I was just kind of watching it casually. There was a lot more to discuss in this first episode than I think I realized when I started really breaking down the character introductions and what to do. And maybe it won't be as much for a while because this episode is introducing everything. So obviously next time we'll be focused more just on the plot and any new little details we get of characters and whatnot. But I'm looking forward to sort of thinking about the themes and talking about the characters and just how the show's going to develop over time. And I guess the other thing that I'd probably add on here is just that the show does have a sense of humor here or there. You know, sometimes Reese's like dry one-liners are kind of funny, and not in like a badass way, in the same way that a Stallone line might be. It's a bit more dry and kind of it's along the same lines, but it's just there's a little bit more of a dryness to it. But I cracked a smile a couple. I won't say I laughed, but I cracked a smile a couple times. So I think that's something that maybe that'll grow on me more as well as we go. It is worth mentioning at this point as well, before I wrap up, that Jonathan Nolan created this show, and he of course went on to co-create Westworld with was it Lisa Joy, is the other person, who I think also worked on this, just not credited as a creator. And Westworld season 1 was great. Season 2 had a lot of good things in it, but was definitely way more messy. And then season 3, despite having some good stuff early on, went off a cliff. And then episode 1 of season 4, I just was like, okay, nothing's gotten better. I'm out. I quit that show, and then the show got cancelled. Not because I quit it, although I don't think I'm that important to the decisions of HBO. But I that was almost like part of the inspiration to go back to this, is because the sense I get from the community that love this show is that it's the better show. It might not feel like the better show to begin with. I think if you compare this episode, for example, to episode 1 of Westworld has so much money behind it, and that first season is so intricate and doing so many wild things with science fiction and the way it plays with narrative structure and all these other things. But the impression I get from this is that this gets better as it goes and has a satisfying overall conclusion and story and all the rest of it. Whereas Westworld had a great idea and a great season 1, and then it started to just slowly fall apart after that. So I'm excited. It's almost like being forced to make it more of like a normal person friendly network TV show, at least to begin with. Like, it's almost like those restraints in some way make any of the other stuff that's going to pop up as time goes on, the more serialized elements, the deeper ideas. It's almost like those feel more special when they sort of like come into it, because we've spent enough time with the characters, assuming the actual episode to episode stuff is also enjoyable. That's something that I think I felt with other network shows in the past. It's something that sadly went away. The only network show I can think of in the last like 5 or 6 years that I liked was Debris, which notably was from some of the same people who worked on Fringe, and it sadly got cancelled after 1 season. It feels like the days of getting invested for me in a network show, it seems like they're done. It seems like anything that I would like will just get cancelled, and none of the ones that stick around or work for me anymore for whatever reason. But so in many ways, this is kind of like the newest. No, that's not true. I like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., right? It's actually my favorite thing from the MCU is Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and it's really standalone, honestly, after a certain point. So I really like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Although that was a kind of a rough start, admittedly, but that really became something that I like in a network TV show. And that started in 2013, so I guess that's the newest one. But Person of Interest is really one of the last network shows, and in terms of the timeline, in terms of like what's newest, that I have even had any interest in bothering to go back and like properly give a chance to. All the interesting stuff, is all shifted to cable and streaming and whatever else. So I'm excited to go through the show. Hopefully some people will want to watch along with, whether or not you've seen it before or not, and we can discover the the goodies. So I said that weird. Anyway, that is my thoughts on episode 1 of Person of Interest. It is very much a network pilot, but it does it about as well as a network pilot can probably do without being a double episode. You know, something like Lost or even Fringe had a double pilot. It's something that network TV used to do a lot, but again, much like a lot of other things that have changed, they don't really do it anymore. But it is, for as much as you can pack into a 40-something minute episode of TV, this does a decent job of doing all that. I suspect next episode the main plot will have a bit more meat to it, just because we don't have to introduce everything and convince Reese to get involved again and all that stuff. So I'll be curious to see how an episode where the main plot gets more time feels. So we'll see. But that is the show. That is episode 1 of Person of Interest. Let me know what you thought of this episode in the comments below. Like, subscribe, ding the bell for notifications, and of course you can support all the content over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV. But that is me, so thank you once again. I'll see you next time. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?